Telecom fraud parks in Myanmar, history, present and future. Historical background. Telecom fraud in Myanmar began to emerge around 2010, gaining momentum after 2015. By 2020, these fraudulent activities had peaked particularly in northern and eastern Myanmar regions, including areas like Myawaddy, which borders Thailand. Criminal organizations have exploited the economic vulnerabilities of individuals, especially targeting those seeking high-paying jobs abroad. Many victims, particularly Chinese citizens, have been lured to Myanmar with promises of lucrative employment only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of exploitation, forced into scam operations and treated like commodities. These criminal groups often refer to their victims as piglets or zhuzai in Chinese, a term that signifies their perceived value as mere tools for profit. The history of these operations reveals a disturbing trend of human trafficking intertwined with telecom fraud, escalating the severity of the issue. Current situation. As of January 2025, the situation remains dire despite recent crackdowns. In early 2020, the Chinese Ministry of Public Security reported the arrest of over 53,000 individuals linked to telecom fraud, which marked a significant effort to dismantle major crime syndicates operating in northern Myanmar. However, reports indicate that the fraud operations have adapted and persisted, particularly in Myawaddy, where organized criminal activities continue to thrive. Scammers have evolved their tactics, targeting not only average citizens but also celebrities and professionals, thus broadening their victim pool. The operations are now increasingly sophisticated, utilizing advanced technology and social engineering techniques to lure victims from various countries, including Russia, Mongolia, Japan, South Korea, and India. Victim stories. The harrowing experiences of victims shed light on the human cost of these fraudulent operations. Dr. Zhang, a PhD holder from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, was lured to Myawaddy under the guise of a job offer. Once there, he was forced to work in a scam center impersonating women online to defraud unsuspecting victims. His ordeal, which included physical abuse and psychological manipulation, highlights the brutal reality faced by many who fall into these traps. Families of missing individuals have also shared their stories, revealing a network of despair and confusion. A joint letter from families of 174 missing individuals went viral on social media, demonstrating the widespread impact of these fraud operations. Many of these families have reported encountering secondary scams while desperately seeking help, compounding their losses and suffering. Future outlook. Experts predict that telecom fraud will continue to pose significant challenges in the future. Despite international cooperation in law enforcement, the adaptability of these criminal organizations suggests that they will continue to shift their operations to evade capture. The emergence of new technologies such as generative AI further complicates the landscape, as scammers tailor their methods to exploit current social trends and individual vulnerabilities. Additionally, the geographical and cultural isolation of areas like Myawaddy makes law enforcement efforts more difficult. With local armed groups often collaborating with criminal organizations, the complexity of combating these crimes increases. There are concerns that as pressures mount in one region, these groups may simply relocate to other areas or even expand their operations internationally. Timeline of key events. 2010 – Emergence of telecom fraud groups in Myanmar. 2015 to 2020 – Rapid expansion of fraud activities, peaking in 2020. 2022 – Dr. Zhang's case highlights the dangers of scams targeting individuals seeking employment. January 2024 – Chinese authorities report the arrest of over 53,000 individuals linked to telecom fraud. September 2024 – The rescue of Chinese actor Wang Xing brings renewed attention to the issue. Conclusion. The issue of telecom fraud in Myanmar is a multifaceted problem that encompasses human trafficking, organized crime, and evolving criminal tactics. While there have been notable efforts to combat these activities, the persistent and adaptive nature of telecom fraud syndicates poses a continuous threat to potential victims. International cooperation and stronger legal measures are essential to protect vulnerable populations and dismantle these criminal networks effectively. The future of telecom fraud in Myanmar will likely depend on the collective response of governments, law enforcement agencies, and communities to address the root causes and provide support to those affected. The issue of telecom fraud parks in Myanmar presents a complex interplay of historical, current, and future trends that reveal counterintuitive dynamics. Below are key aspects that highlight these unexpected elements. 1. Historical underestimation of growth. Initially, telecom fraud in Myanmar was underestimated. It began around 2010 but surged dramatically after 2015, peaking around 2020. This rapid growth contrasted with the slow initial recognition of the problem's severity, indicating a lag in awareness that often accompanies emerging criminal enterprises. 2. Victim recruitment strategies. Counterintuitively, many victims, such as skilled professionals like Dr. Zhang, were lured by offers of legitimate high-paying jobs. This recruitment tactic exploits the desperation of individuals facing economic hardships, showcasing how educated and seemingly savvy individuals can fall prey to sophisticated scams. The idea that only the vulnerable or uneducated can be victims is misleading. 3. Evolution of scamming techniques. The scammers continuously evolve their methods, adapting to law enforcement pressures. This adaptability, including the targeting of high-profile individuals and the use of new technologies like generative AI, suggests that rather than diminishing, the sophistication and scale of these operations are increasing. This evolution challenges the expectation that law enforcement crackdowns will result in a significant reduction in such activities. 4. International expansion of targets. While the initial focus was on Chinese victims, the scope of telecom fraud has expanded to include nationals from various countries including Russia, Mongolia, Japan, South Korea, and India. This broadening of targets defies the assumption that such crime networks would remain localized, highlighting a transnational nature that complicates law enforcement efforts and underscores a more globalized criminal landscape. 5. Impact of law enforcement on criminal operations. The significant arrests made by Chinese authorities, claiming to have apprehended over 53,000 suspects, highlight a paradox. While large-scale crackdowns seem effective, they also trigger a relocation of criminal operations rather than an outright cessation. Scammers adapt by moving their operations, indicating that law enforcement actions can inadvertently lead to the diffusion of criminal activity rather than its eradication. 6. Victimization of families. The phenomenon of families becoming victims themselves in the quest to rescue loved ones is particularly counterintuitive. Many families, desperate to locate and save missing relatives, have fallen victim to secondary scams, losing substantial amounts of money. This suggests a cycle of victimization that perpetuates the issue as families become targets for further exploitation while trying to assist their loved ones. 7. Cultural and regional isolation. The geographical and cultural isolation of areas like Myawaddy complicates law enforcement efforts. This isolation allows scam operations to flourish even amidst crackdowns, contradicting the notion that increased law enforcement presence would automatically lead to decreased crime rates. Instead, these zones can become fortified havens for organized crime. 8. Perception of safety and risk. The public perception of safety in regions affected by telecom fraud can be misleading. The belief that such frauds only target the uneducated or those seeking easy money overlooks the reality that anyone, regardless of background or profession, can become a victim. This misperception can lead to complacency among potential victims, increasing their risk of falling prey to scams. 9. Psychological manipulation and control. Scam operations employ severe psychological manipulation and control over victims, which can be surprising given the high level of education among some of the victims. Techniques that include physical abuse and confinement reveal a brutal underbelly to these schemes that contradicts the more sanitized image of cybercrime typically portrayed in media narratives. 10. Long-term societal impacts. The long-term societal impacts of telecom fraud extend beyond immediate financial losses. The trauma experienced by victims and their families can have lasting psychological effects, creating a legacy of fear and mistrust that permeates communities. This social cost is often overlooked in discussions of crime, which typically prioritize economic impacts. Conclusion: the dynamics surrounding telecom fraud parks in Myanmar illustrate a complex web of deceit, victimization, and adaptation that challenges traditional narratives about crime and its impact. Understanding these counterintuitive elements is crucial for developing effective strategies to combat such pervasive issues in the future. The report on telecom fraud parks in Myanmar, particularly in the context of Myawaddy, highlights several critical aspects that many may overlook but are significant for understanding the broader implications of these criminal activities. Evolution of scamming techniques. One of the most important but often overlooked aspects is the evolution of scamming techniques used by fraudsters. Reports indicate that these scammers have shifted their focus to target not just vulnerable individuals but also celebrities and intellectuals for higher profits. This evolution signifies a growing sophistication in their operations, reflecting their adaptability in response to law enforcement crackdowns. The significance here lies in the potential for increased victimization across various demographics. As the scammers refine their tactics to exploit different vulnerabilities. The role of human trafficking. Another critical point often overshadowed is the intertwining of telecom fraud with human trafficking. Victims, often referred to as piglets or zhuzai, are lured under the guise of high-paying jobs and then subjected to inhumane conditions. This connection highlights a grim reality: the victims of telecom fraud are not just financial targets but are treated as commodities within a larger human trafficking network. Understanding this relationship is crucial for developing comprehensive strategies to combat these crimes, as addressing one issue without acknowledging the other may lead to incomplete solutions. Cross-border criminal networks. The report also emphasizes the transnational nature of these fraud networks. While many may recognize that these scams occur across borders, the complexity of the organized crime structures involved is often underestimated. The organized nature of these operations, with their tight hierarchies and international connections, complicates law enforcement efforts. This highlights the need for enhanced international cooperation and intelligence sharing to effectively dismantle these networks. Psychological manipulation and control. The psychological manipulation and control exerted over victims are significant but frequently overlooked aspects. Victims are often coerced into participating in scams through threats and violence, creating a cycle of fear and compliance. The stories of individuals facing severe physical abuse for attempting to escape illustrate the brutality of these operations. Recognizing the psychological dimensions of this exploitation is vital for providing adequate support and rehabilitation for victims upon their rescue. Public awareness and vulnerability. The report underscores a critical gap in public awareness regarding the risks associated with job offers abroad, particularly in regions like Myanmar. While there may be a general understanding of scams, the specific tactics employed by fraudsters to lure victims can often go unnoticed. This highlights a significant need for educational campaigns and preventive measures aimed at informing potential victims about the red flags of such scams. The impact of law enforcement measures. While significant progress has been made in combating telecom fraud through collaborative law enforcement efforts, the report indicates that these measures have led to the adaptation of fraudsters rather than their eradication. The scammers' ability to relocate and alter their operations in response to law enforcement pressure suggests a continuous cat-and-mouse game. This is significant because it implies that without sustained pressure and adaptation from law enforcement, the problem is unlikely to diminish. The human cost. Finally, the human cost of these scams is often reduced to statistics. But the individual stories of victims and their families reveal the profound emotional and psychological toll of such experiences. The desperation of families searching for missing loved ones and the trauma experienced by survivors are critical narratives that should be highlighted. Recognizing the human side of these statistics is essential for fostering empathy and motivating action against these crimes. Conclusion. In summary, the report on telecom fraud parks in Myanmar provides a multifaceted view of a complex issue that extends beyond mere financial crime. The evolution of scamming techniques, the intersection with human trafficking, the organized nature of the network's psychological manipulation, the necessity of public awareness, the impact of law enforcement measures, and the human cost are all integral components that require attention. Addressing these overlooked aspects is crucial for developing effective strategies to combat telecom fraud and protect potential victims. 1. Historical context and evolution of telecom fraud in Myanmar. The origins of telecom fraud in Myanmar date back to around 2010, with a significant surge after 2015 peaking around 2020. The development of these operations involved the exploitation of vulnerable individuals, particularly Chinese nationals, who were lured with promises of high-paying jobs only to find themselves trapped in coercive scam environments. The historical trajectory illustrates the increasing sophistication of these criminal enterprises and their adaptation to law enforcement pressures over time. 2. Current trends in scam operations. Despite recent crackdowns, telecom fraud remains rampant, particularly in regions like Myawaddy. The operational strategies of these syndicates have evolved to target a broader spectrum of victims, including celebrities and intellectuals, reflecting a shift towards more lucrative schemes. The significant uptick in the number of victims from various nations indicates a troubling expansion of these activities, which are now not limited to Chinese nationals but also include individuals from countries such as Russia, Mongolia, Japan, South Korea, and India. 3. Human trafficking and victimization. Many victims of telecom fraud parks are subjected to human trafficking, where they are not just fraudulently exploited but also physically and psychologically abused. The harrowing experiences of survivors highlight the brutality of these operations, including forced labor, severe punishments for underperformance, and a lack of escape routes. The emotional toll on families of missing individuals underscores the profound human cost of these scams, as many suffer from the dual trauma of losing loved ones and falling victim to subsequent scams while seeking help. 4. Future outlook and challenges. The future of telecom fraud in Myanmar appears grim, with experts warning that these criminal syndicates may continue to adapt moving operations to evade law enforcement while evolving their tactics to exploit new technologies. The geopolitical context, including the relationship between China and Myanmar, and the role of local armed groups, complicates efforts to combat these crimes. The potential for increased international collaboration among law enforcement agencies may be a crucial factor in addressing the ongoing challenges posed by these sophisticated and transnational criminal networks. 1. The Nigerian Prince Scam. The Nigerian Prince scam is one of the most well-known and enduring types of telecommunication fraud. This scam typically involves an email from someone claiming to be a wealthy individual, often a prince or a government official, who needs assistance transferring a large sum of money out of Nigeria. Victims are persuaded to provide their banking information or pay various fees to facilitate the transaction. This scam has evolved over the years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to lure victims, and has led to substantial financial losses globally. The scale and persistence of this type of fraud highlight the vulnerability of individuals to scams that exploit trust and greed. 2. The Ponzi scheme of Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff orchestrated one of the largest financial frauds in history through a Ponzi scheme that defrauded thousands of investors out of billions of dollars. Madoff promised consistent high returns on investments, attracting a significant number of investors. The scheme unraveled in 2008 when Madoff could no longer pay returns to earlier investors, revealing that he was not investing the money as promised but rather using new investors' funds to pay off old ones. This case emphasizes the importance of regulatory oversight and the potential for even sophisticated individuals to fall victim to fraudulent schemes. 3. The Russian Internet Scam, the Russian Hackers. In the early 2010s, a series of cybercrime operations emerged from Russia, targeting businesses and individuals worldwide. These hackers engaged in identity theft, credit card fraud, and various forms of online scams. They exploited vulnerabilities in computer systems to steal sensitive information, which was then sold on the dark web or used for fraudulent transactions. This case underscores the evolution of fraud in the digital age, where technology is leveraged to commit crimes on a global scale, affecting millions of victims and leading to significant financial losses. Future outlook on telecom fraud parks in Myanmar. Historical context and current situation. Telecom fraud in Myanmar has evolved significantly since it first emerged around 2010. Initially localized, it gained momentum post-2015 and peaked around 2020 with organized crime syndicates primarily targeting Chinese citizens by luring them with promises of high-paying jobs. Despite recent crackdowns and international collaboration between China and Myanmar to combat these crimes, fraud activities have persisted, especially in regions like Myawaddy, which remains a hotspot for such operations. Evolving tactics and expansion. As law enforcement agencies intensify their efforts to dismantle fraudulent operations, these syndicates are expected to adapt by changing their tactics and operational bases. Experts predict that 1. Geographical shifts. Fraud syndicates may relocate operations to less monitored areas, possibly moving to neighboring countries or even further afield. Areas in the Middle East or other Southeast Asian nations could become new hubs, driven by the need to evade law enforcement. 2. Target diversification. The scope of victims is likely to expand beyond Chinese nationals to include individuals from various countries, including India, South Korea, Japan, and Russia. This diversification is fueled by the syndicates' increasing sophistication and adaptability. 3. Technological integration. The use of advanced technologies, including generative AI and social media, will likely enhance the effectiveness of these scams. This could lead to more personalized and convincing fraudulent schemes that resonate with different demographics, making it challenging for potential victims to identify them. Law enforcement and international cooperation. The collaborative efforts between China and Myanmar have yielded some results, as evidenced by the capture of thousands of suspects linked to telecom fraud. However, the complexity of organized crime necessitates ongoing and expanded cooperation. 1. Enhanced cross-border cooperation. Future strategies may involve more robust intelligence sharing mechanisms and joint operations across borders, not just between China and Myanmar, but also involving other Southeast Asian nations. 2. Community awareness programs. There will likely be an increased emphasis on public awareness initiatives aimed at educating potential victims about the signs of fraud and providing resources for reporting suspicious activities. 3. Legal reforms. Both countries may need to reform legal frameworks to address the nuances of transnational crime more effectively, ensuring that law enforcement agencies have the necessary tools to combat evolving crime tactics. Social implications and victim support. As telecom fraud continues to grow, the societal impact will be profound. Families of victims will require ongoing support. 1. Mental health services. There will likely be a greater need for psychological support for victims and their families, as the trauma associated with such scams can be significant and long-lasting. 2. Victim advocacy. Advocacy groups may emerge to support victims' families, ensuring they have access to legal recourse and resources to help locate missing loved ones. 3. Public sentiment. There may be an increasing public outcry for government accountability in protecting citizens from such crimes, leading to pressure on authorities to act decisively. Conclusion. The future of telecom fraud parks in Myanmar is marked by an ongoing battle between law enforcement efforts and the adaptive strategies of criminal syndicates. While recent gains in curbing fraud activities show promise, the persistent evolution of tactics and targets poses a significant challenge. Effective international cooperation, community education, and victim support will be crucial in addressing this complex issue. Over the coming years, the landscape of telecom fraud will likely change, but the need for vigilance and proactive measures will remain paramount in protecting potential victims.